She was 23 years old, 5 months pregnant, and standing in the parking lot of the company she had given everything to, holding a cardboard box that contained the entire sum of her professional life. A coffee mug with a chipped handle, a framed photo of her mother, a small cactus she had kept alive on her desk for 3 years, and a letter of termination that still smelled like the printer toner from the HR office on the 4th floor. Her badge had been deactivated before she reached the elevator. Security had walked her out. Not roughly, not cruelly, but with that particular brand of rehearsed politeness that made it clear this was not a conversation. It was a procedure. She stood there in the late October air, the North Carolina wind pulling at her coat, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, where something small and alive kicked against her palm as if to say, "I'm still here." She expected anger. She expected tears. What she didn't expect was the silence. The vast, ringing emptiness of realizing that the place where she had spent 2,147 days of her life could erase her in 2 hours and 15 minutes. What she also didn't expect was that the man who signed that termination letter, the man who shook her hand and said it was just business, would be standing in her office 11 years later, in a suit that no longer fit quite right, asking her for a job. But to understand how that moment came to be, you have to go back, not to the termination, not to the pregnancy. You have to go back to a 2-bedroom apartment on Callaway Street in Garner, North Carolina, where a girl named Elena Marquez grew up learning that work was not something you did. It was something you were. Her mother, Rosa, cleaned houses. Not one house, not 2, 7 houses a week, Monday through Saturday, each one belonging to a family that made in a month what Rosa made in a year. Rosa Marquez was 4 feet 11 inches tall, had hands that were perpetually raw from bleach and hot water, and had never once in her life called in sick. She had emigrated from Guatemala at 19 with a husband who left before Elena's 2nd birthday, a suitcase held together with packing tape, and a conviction so deep it was structural, that if you worked hard enough, long enough, honestly enough, the world would eventually recognize you. She never questioned this, even when the world gave her every reason to. Elena watched her mother leave the apartment at 5:15 every morning and return at 7:30 every evening, smelling of Pine Sol and other people's laundry. She watched her mother iron blouses she could never afford to buy. She watched her mother eat standing up because sitting down felt like wasting time. And she absorbed something from this that no classroom could have taught her, that dignity was not given. It was built, day by day, task by task, with your hands, with your back, with the quiet, relentless refusal to stop. Elena was not a remarkable student. She would have been the first to tell you that. She was a B student, sometimes a B-, who had to study twice as long as her classmates to understand concepts that seemed to come to them like breathing. But she had something that no grade could measure. She paid attention, not just to textbooks and teachers, but to people. She watched how they moved, what they said, what they didn't say. She noticed which managers at her after-school job at the grocery store actually knew their employees' names and which ones looked through them like glass. She noticed which customers left their carts in the parking lot and which ones pushed them back to the corral, and she filed away these observations in a part of her mind that she didn't have a name for yet, but that would one day become the foundation of everything she built. She graduated from Garner High School in 2006, 47th in a class of 312, with no scholarships, no connections, and no plan beyond the one her mother had modeled: work, find a job, show up, be the last one to leave. She started at Whitfield & Crane the following September. Whitfield & Crane was a mid-sized marketing and branding firm in Raleigh, occupying 3 floors of a glass building on Fayetteville Street that looked more impressive from the outside than it was on the inside. The carpets were stained in the hallways. The break room refrigerator had a smell that no one could identify or eliminate. But the company had clients, real clients, regional banks, and restaurant chains, and a growing portfolio of tech startups. And it had a reputation for aggressive, results-driven work that attracted a certain kind of ambitious young professional. Elena was not hired as one of those professionals. She was hired as an administrative assistant in the accounts department, answering phones, organizing files, scheduling meetings for people whose names appeared on business cards with titles like Senior Brand Strategist and Vice President of Client Relations. Her starting salary was $28,400 a year. She took the bus to work because she could not afford a car. She brought lunch from home every day, rice and beans in a plastic container that she ate at her desk while reading industry publications she had no reason to read, except that she wanted to understand what the people around her were doing and why. Within 6 months, she had memorized every active client account, not because anyone asked her to, because she listened. She sat in the back of meetings taking minutes, and she listened to the way the senior staff talked about campaigns, about demographics, about return on investment and brand positioning and customer lifetime value. She didn't understand all of it at first, but she understood enough to know that the people being paid 3 and 4 times her salary were often saying things she had already figured out from reading the files. She started staying late, not because she was told to, but because the office was quiet after 6 p.m. and she could use the computers to teach herself things: analytics software, design principles, the basics of search engine optimization, which in 2007 was still something most traditional marketing firms treated like a novelty rather than a revolution. She taught herself in the same way her mother cleaned houses, methodically, thoroughly, without complaint, and without anyone noticing. The person who did notice eventually was a woman named Patricia Okafor. Patricia was 54 years old, a senior account manager who had been at Whitfield & Crane for 18 years, and who carried herself with the particular authority of someone who had survived every reorganization, every management change, every round of layoffs by being too competent to lose. She was tall, thin, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had a habit of appearing silently behind people who thought they were alone. One evening in March of 2008, she appeared behind Elena, who was sitting at a design workstation at 8:45 p.m., teaching herself how to build a client presentation deck from a YouTube tutorial. Patricia watched for 43 seconds before she spoke. "What are you doing here?" she said. Elena nearly fell out of the chair. "I'm learning," she said, and the simplicity of the answer, the absence of excuse or apology, made Patricia pull up a chair and sit down. "Show me," she said. And Elena showed her. She showed her the client files she'd reorganized, the analytics reports she'd been generating on her own time, the draft of a social media strategy she'd written for a client that the assigned team had been struggling with for weeks. Patricia read it in silence, turning the pages slowly, her face giving away nothing. Then she looked at Elena over the top of her glasses and said, "Who told you to do this?" "Nobody," Elena said. Patricia nodded. "That's what I thought," she said. "Come see me tomorrow morning. 8 a.m. Don't be late." What Patricia did the next morning was something no one else at Whitfield & Crane had ever done for Elena. She took her seriously. She didn't promote her. She didn't give her a raise. What she did was more valuable than either of those things. She gave her access. She started bringing Elena into client meetings, not as a note-taker, but as a participant. She introduced her to clients as my colleague. She reviewed Elena's work with the same rigor she applied to the senior staff, which meant she was harder on her than anyone had ever been, marking up her presentations with red pen, sending drafts back 3 and 4 times, demanding clarity, precision, evidence. Elena did not complain. She did not cry in the bathroom, though she came close twice. She rewrote. She revised. She stayed later. She got better. And over the next 18 months, something happened that was invisible to most of the office, but obvious to anyone paying attention. Elena Marquez became the most effective person on the 3rd floor. Her client retention numbers were the highest on the team. Her campaign proposals were generating measurable results. She had taught herself more about digital marketing than most of the senior strategists who had MBAs from schools that cost more per semester than Rosa Marquez made in a year. In 2009, she was promoted to junior account executive. In 2010, to account executive. In 2012, to senior account executive. Each promotion came with a raise that felt significant until she calculated it against the salaries of the men who held the same title and had been hired after her. She was making $52,000. Derek Whitfield, the founder's son, who had been hired as a senior account executive the same year, with no prior experience beyond a degree from Wake Forest and a last name on the building, was making $78,000. She knew this because she had seen the payroll spreadsheet on Patricia's desk, upside down, for 11 seconds, long enough to read 3 lines that rearranged something inside her. She didn't say anything. Not then. She filed it in the same place she filed everything. The quiet archive of injustices that she carried like stones in her pockets, weighing her down so gradually she almost didn't notice the heaviness until she tried to stand up straight. By 2013, Elena was managing more client revenue than anyone in the company except Patricia herself. She had brought in 14 new accounts over 2 years. She had developed a proprietary process for onboarding small business clients that reduced the initial engagement timeline from 6 weeks to 11 days. She was 29 years old. She was running on 5 hours of sleep a night. And she had met someone, a quiet, steady man named David Park, a civil engineer who designed bridges and drainage systems for the county, and who had a habit of showing up at her apartment at 9 p.m. with takeout containers and a willingness to sit in silence while she finished working. David did not try to fix her. He did not tell her she was working too hard. He told her she was brilliant, and then he handed her a fork and opened the container of pad thai and said, "Eat something." They were married in a small ceremony in April of 2014 in Patricia Okafor's backyard because Elena's apartment was too small and David's parents lived in Oregon, and Rosa insisted that the wedding should be somewhere beautiful, and Patricia's garden, with its climbing roses and its Japanese maple and its stone bench overlooking a small creek, was the most beautiful place Elena had ever been. The next year and a half was the closest thing to equilibrium Elena had ever known. She was good at her job. She was loved at home. She had a mentor who believed in her and a husband who understood her. She began to allow herself cautiously, provisionally, the way you open a window just a crack when you're not sure if the air outside is safe. She began to allow herself to imagine a future, a bigger role at the company, maybe a directorship, maybe eventually a partnership. She allowed herself to imagine these things while simultaneously knowing, in the place where she kept the payroll numbers and the memory of security guards and the sound of doors closing behind her, that imagining was dangerous, that the world did not keep its promises to people like her. That hope was a luxury she could not quite afford. But she imagined anyway, because David made her feel safe enough to try, and because the life inside her, discovered on a Tuesday morning in July of 2015, confirmed by 2 pink lines on a test she took in the bathroom at work during her lunch break, made the future feel, for the first time, like something worth planning for. She was 6 weeks pregnant when she found out. She was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy glow people talk about, and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in her life, multiple things were going right at the same time. She told David first, on their couch, with the pad thai containers still on the coffee table, and he didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something between awe and terror and the deepest kind of gratitude. And then he pulled her close and said, "I'm going to be so good at this." She believed him. She told her mother next, on the phone, and Rosa cried for 4 minutes straight without saying a word. She told Patricia the following Monday in her office, with the door closed, and Patricia looked at her for a long moment, and then said, with characteristic directness, "How are you planning to handle the optics?" Elena didn't understand the question at first. Then she did. Patricia was not asking about the baby. She was asking about the men on the 4th floor, about the founder, Gerald Whitfield, who was 67 years old and had built the company in 1987 on the principles of relentless productivity, minimal overhead, and a deeply held belief that personal lives were a liability the company should not be expected to accommodate. About his son, Derek, who had risen to vice president not through competence, but through chromosomal luck, and who had once said, in a meeting Elena was present for, that the company's biggest mistake was offering maternity leave at all when they could simply hire people who didn't need it. Patricia had been at the company long enough to know what happened to women who got pregnant. They didn't get fired, not officially, not in a way that would hold up in court. They got reassigned, their accounts got redistributed, their responsibilities got gradually, quietly siphoned away until they returned from leave to find themselves sitting in the same chair but doing a different job. A smaller job, a job that didn't matter, a job designed to make them quit so the company wouldn't have to fire them. Patricia had seen it happen 3 times. She told Elena this with the door closed and her voice low, not to scare her, but to prepare her. "Be strategic," Patricia said. "Don't tell them until you have to. Document everything, and whatever you do, don't give them a reason." Elena followed this advice with the same discipline she applied to everything. She continued working at her usual pace, which is to say, at a pace that would have been considered excessive for two people, let alone one person, growing a human being inside her body. She arrived at 7:30. She left at 7. She hit every deadline. She exceeded every target. She brought in 2 new clients in August and 3 more in September. She did not mention the pregnancy. She wore looser clothing. She scheduled her doctor's appointments for early mornings and late afternoons when the office was thin. She drank ginger tea at her desk to manage the nausea that hit her every day between 2 and 4 p.m. like clockwork. A nausea so intense that twice she had to excuse herself from client calls to throw up in the bathroom on the 2nd floor because the 3rd floor bathroom was too close to the open plan workspace, and she was terrified someone would hear. She made it to 17 weeks before someone noticed. It was not a colleague. It was not Patricia. It was Derek Whitfield, who happened to be standing behind her in the elevator on a Thursday in October when she turned sideways to let someone pass, and her coat shifted in a way that revealed what she had been hiding. He didn't say anything in the elevator. He said something later to his father in the 4th floor office with the mahogany desk and the framed motivational posters that said things like, "Excellence is not an act, but a habit." He said it casually, the way you mentioned that it might rain later. And what Gerald Whitfield did with that information set into motion a sequence of events that would dismantle Elena's career at the company in exactly 19 days. It started with a redistribution. On Monday, 2 of her largest accounts were reassigned to Derek's team. No explanation was given. When Elena asked her direct supervisor, a man named Craig Peterson, who had the emotional range of a filing cabinet, he said it was a strategic rebalancing. On Wednesday, she was removed from the pitch team for a potential client worth $1.2 million annually, a pitch she had spent 3 weeks preparing. On the following Monday, she arrived at work to find that her access to the company's analytics platform had been downgraded from administrator to viewer. She could see the data, but could no longer run reports, build dashboards, or access the client performance metrics she had been using to do her job for the past 4 years. She went to Craig. Craig said it was an IT issue. She went to IT. IT said the change had been requested by management. She went to Patricia. Patricia closed her door, sat down, and said, "It's happening. I'm sorry. I told you it would happen. We need to talk about what you're going to do." What Elena did was what she had been trained by 29 years of life to do. She kept working. She worked harder. She arrived earlier. She stayed later. She produced results that were impossible to ignore. She documented every reassignment, every access change, every meeting she was excluded from, every email that should have included her but didn't. She kept a folder on her personal laptop, a folder she backed up to a thumb drive that she kept in her purse. And in that folder, she placed every piece of evidence that told the story she already knew but could not yet prove, that they were not restructuring. They were removing her. And the only thing that had changed between the version of Elena they valued and the version they were discarding was the life growing inside her. On November 14th, 2015, she was called into Gerald Whitfield's office. Gerald was there, Derek was there, Craig Peterson was there. A woman from HR named Sandra Lim was there, holding a manila folder and wearing the carefully neutral expression of someone whose job it was to make things that were wrong sound reasonable. Sandra did most of the talking. She used phrases like changing business needs and organizational restructuring and role elimination. She explained that Elena's position was being dissolved as part of a company-wide efficiency initiative. She noted that Elena would receive 2 weeks severance pay, $2,000 before taxes, and that her health insurance would continue through the end of the month. She said this in the same tone you might use to describe the weather. Elena sat in the chair across from Gerald's desk, her hands folded over her belly, and she looked at each of them in turn. She looked at Craig, who wouldn't meet her eyes. She looked at Sandra, who held eye contact with the practiced steadiness of someone who had done this many times before. She looked at Derek, who was looking at his phone. And she looked at Gerald Whitfield, who was 67 years old and sitting behind a desk he had bought in 1987, and who looked at her and said, "We appreciate everything you've done here, Elena. This is just business." She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She didn't mention the pregnancy because she understood, with a clarity that felt like a blade, that mentioning it was exactly what they wanted her to do. They wanted her to say it so they could deny it. They wanted the conversation on record so they could point to the restructuring, the efficiency initiative, the role elimination, and say, "See? It had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She gave them nothing." She stood up. She shook Gerald's hand because her mother had taught her that dignity was something you carried with you, especially when people were trying to take it. She walked to her desk. She packed the coffee mug, the photo, the cactus. Security walked her to the elevator. The badge beeped its rejection. The doors opened to the parking lot, and she stood there, 23 weeks pregnant, holding a box that weighed less than 5 pounds, feeling the full gravitational weight of a future that had just collapsed. David was waiting in the parking lot. Patricia had called him. He was leaning against his truck with his arms crossed and his face doing that thing it did when he was trying very hard not to show how angry he was. A stillness that was louder than shouting. He took the box from her. He opened the truck door. He didn't say it's going to be okay because David Park did not say things he could not guarantee. What he said was, "We'll figure it out." And then he drove her home, stopping on the way to buy ginger tea and pad thai because some rituals are more important when the world is falling apart than when everything is fine. The weeks that followed were the hardest Elena had ever lived through, and she had lived through a childhood where the electricity was shut off 3 times, and her mother had once worked a 14-hour day with a broken wrist because she couldn't afford to see a doctor. But this was different. This was not the familiar hardship of not having enough. This was the specific, targeted cruelty of being discarded by people who knew her value and chose to throw it away anyway. She filed for unemployment. She was denied. The company had classified her departure as a voluntary resignation. She appealed. The appeal took 11 weeks. She contacted a lawyer. The lawyer, a tired man in a cluttered office on Hillsborough Street, listened to her story, looked at her documentation, and told her she had a case. A strong case, probably. But that pursuing it would take 18 months to 3 years, cost between $15,000 and $40,000 in legal fees, and that even if she won, the settlement would likely be less than a year's salary. He told her this with genuine sympathy. He told her he had seen this exact scenario dozens of times. He told her the system was not designed to help people like her. She thanked him. She left his office. She sat in her car in the parking lot for 22 minutes. Not crying, not moving, just sitting with her hands on the steering wheel and her baby pressing against her ribs, and she made a decision that she would not understand the full significance of for years. She decided she would never work for someone else again. The decision was not dramatic. It was not accompanied by a soaring internal monologue or a moment of cinematic clarity. It was more like a bone setting after a break, a quiet, painful click of something moving into the position it was always supposed to hold. She went home. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the folder, the one with the documentation, the evidence, the records of everything Whitfield and Crane had taken from her. And then she opened a new folder beside it. She labeled it Mine, and she started writing. What she wrote over the next 6 weeks, between doctor's appointments and unemployment office visits, and the relentless physical discomfort of a 3rd trimester that seemed determined to test every boundary of her endurance, was a business plan. Not a grand one, not a visionary manifesto, a practical document, 14 pages, single-spaced, with specific numbers and realistic projections, and a service model built on everything she had learned in 7 years at a company that had used her and discarded her. She would start a marketing consultancy. She would focus on small businesses, the ones too small for firms like Whitfield and Crane, the ones run by people like her mother, who worked 70-hour weeks and couldn't afford a $10,000 monthly retainer, but who desperately needed someone to help them reach customers, build brands, and grow beyond the limits of word of mouth and hope. She would charge what they could afford. She would deliver more than they expected, and she would build it from nothing, because nothing was all she had. Her daughter was born on January 8th, 2016, at 3:47 in the morning, after 19 hours of labor that Elena would later describe as the only honest work she'd ever done, the only time the effort and the result were perfectly, indisputably connected. They named her Lucia after David's grandmother, and Rosa held her in the hospital room and wept in a way that was different from the weeping on the phone, deeper, older, as though she were crying not just for joy, but for every sacrifice that had led to this moment, every house she had cleaned, every blouse she had ironed, every morning she had left a sleeping child to go make someone else's home beautiful so that her own child might one day have something better. Elena watched her mother hold her daughter and understood for the first time the full architecture of love. That it was not a feeling, but a structure, built over decades, load-bearing, invisible to everyone except the people it held up. She started the company 6 weeks after Lucia was born. The company was called Puente, bridge in Spanish, because that's what David built for a living, and that's what Elena intended to build for her clients, connecting them to the people who needed them. Her office was the kitchen table. Her equipment was a laptop David had bought refurbished for $340, a phone with a cracked screen, and a printer that jammed every third page. Her first client was a woman named Mei Ling Chen, who ran a Vietnamese restaurant on Capitol Boulevard that had been open for 11 years and had never had a website, a social media presence, or a marketing strategy of any kind. Mei Ling was 58 years old, worked 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, made the best pho in Wake County, and was 3 months behind on her lease. Elena charged her $200 a month. She built her a website in 4 days. She set up her social media accounts. She photographed the food herself on her phone with natural light from the restaurant's front window, holding Lucia in a carrier on her chest while she adjusted bowls of broth and plates of spring rolls. Within 3 months, Mei Ling's revenue had increased by 34%. Within 6 months, she was current on her lease. Within a year, she had hired 2 additional staff members and was considering a second location. Mei Ling told everyone she knew. And in the economy of small business, where reputation travels through conversations over counters and recommendations whispered between owners at supply stores and Chamber of Commerce meetings, being told about by Mei Ling Chen was worth more than any advertising campaign Elena could have designed. The clients came slowly at first. A barbershop, a landscaping company, a woman who made custom wedding cakes out of her garage. Elena took every one of them. She worked while Lucia napped. She worked while Lucia nursed. She worked at 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. and during the 22 minutes between dropping Lucia at Rosa's house and her first client call of the day. David built her a desk in the spare bedroom, assembled it himself, sanded the wood smooth, attached a small shelf for the cactus that had survived the parking lot, and she sat at that desk for 16 months before she earned enough to rent actual office space. The office was a single room above a dry cleaner on Western Boulevard. It smelled like fabric softener and ambition. It had one window that overlooked a parking lot. She put Lucia's car seat in the corner and a sign on the door that said Puente Marketing, and she sat down at her second-hand desk and she thought about Gerald Whitfield and his mahogany desk and his motivational posters, and she did not feel angry. She felt something harder to name, something quieter, a settling, a certainty. The knowledge that the distance between his desk and hers was not a measure of her failure, but a measure of what she was willing to build. By the end of 2017, Puente had 23 clients. By the end of 2018, it had 41. Elena had hired her first employee, a 22-year-old graphic designer named Jordan, who had graduated from community college and who reminded Elena so much of herself that it made her chest ache. And then a second, a data analyst named Priya, who could make a spreadsheet sing, and who had been turned down by 6 firms before Elena hired her in a 15-minute interview that consisted mostly of Elena saying, "Show me what you can do," and Priya showing her. The company's revenue in 2018 was $340,000. It was not a fortune. It was not $1 million. It was a number that represented something more valuable than its face value. It represented proof. Proof that the 14-page business plan written by a pregnant woman at a kitchen table was not a fantasy. Proof that the clients she served, the restaurant owners, the barbers, the cake makers, the landscapers, were not too small to matter. Proof that Elena Marquez was not too small to matter. The growth was not linear. There were months when payroll was a prayer. There were clients who didn't pay. There was a 6-week period in the spring of 2019 when Elena seriously considered closing the business because a large client had defaulted on a $28,000 invoice and she could not make rent on the office and payroll in the same month. David sat with her at the kitchen table, the same table where the business plan had been written, and they went through the numbers together, line by line, and David said, "Can we survive this month?" And Elena said, "Yes, if I don't pay myself." And David said, "Then don't pay yourself. We'll eat rice." And they did. They ate rice and beans and whatever Rosa brought over in Tupperware containers that appeared on the doorstep with no note, because Rosa had never needed words to say what mattered. And the business survived, and the next month was better, and the month after that was better still. By 2020, Puente had moved to a larger office, a 3-room suite in a converted warehouse in downtown Raleigh's warehouse district, with exposed brick walls and large windows that let in the kind of golden afternoon light that Elena had been describing in her clients' social media posts for years, but had never had in her own space. She had a team of 7. She had clients across 3 states. She had developed a reputation in the small business community that transcended marketing. People came to Puente not just because Elena could build them a brand, but because Elena understood them. She understood what it meant to start with nothing. She understood the terror of making payroll. She understood the loneliness of being the person who locks up the shop at 10 p.m. and wonders if any of it matters. And she translated that understanding into work that didn't just look good but felt true. Campaigns that captured who her clients actually were, not some polished corporate fiction, but the real, messy, beautiful truth of people who poured their lives into their work because they didn't know how to do anything else. The pandemic should have destroyed her. It destroyed businesses far bigger and better funded than hers. But Elena had spent her entire life preparing for collapse without knowing it. She had learned from her mother that when everything falls apart, you find a way. She pivoted. She moved her entire operation online in 72 hours. She called every single one of her clients, 67 of them, personally in 3 days, and asked them what they needed. Most of them needed the same thing: help figuring out how to survive when the doors were closed. She built them e-commerce sites. She set up delivery systems. She ran social media campaigns for restaurants doing curbside pickup and bakeries shipping nationwide for the first time, and a barbershop owner who started selling his own line of grooming products because if people couldn't come to the shop would come to them. She did this for 14 to 16 hours a day while homeschooling Lucia, who was now 4 and who had her father's patience and her mother's stubbornness, and who sat at the kitchen table doing crayon drawings of butterflies while her mother rebuilt other people's businesses, one Zoom call at a time. In 2021, Puente's revenue crossed $1 million. In 2022, it crossed $2.4 million. In 2023, it reached $4.1 million. Elena had 22 employees. She had an office that took up an entire floor of the warehouse building. She had clients in 11 states. She had been featured in InKitchen magazine in a story titled "The Consultant Who Builds Bridges," and in a local news segment that had made Rosa cry for the 4th documented time in her life. She had a house, a real house, with a yard and a garden and a room for Lucia that had a window overlooking a magnolia tree. David had built a bookshelf in the living room and a swing set in the backyard and a small desk in Lucia's room that was an exact miniature replica of the desk he had built for Elena in the spare bedroom 7 years earlier, right down to the small shelf where a cactus sat. Not the original cactus, which had finally died in the winter of 2019, but a new one, a cutting from a plant Mei Ling had given her, which felt like the kind of continuity that mattered more than words could hold. She was in her office on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2024 when her assistant told her someone was in the lobby asking to see her without an appointment. This was not unusual. Small business owners sometimes walked in off the street, having heard about Puente from a friend or a neighboring shop owner. Elena told her assistant to show them in. She was finishing an email. She looked up when the door opened, and the world folded in on itself like a letter being returned to its envelope, because standing in her doorway, in a suit that was slightly too big in the shoulders, as though he had lost weight recently, or perhaps had simply shrunk in the way that certain men shrink when the structures that held them up are removed, was Gerald Whitfield. He was 76 years old. His hair, which had been steel gray the last time she saw him, was white and thin. His hands, which she remembered as large and decisive, looked uncertain now. They held nothing. They gripped nothing. They hung at his sides like they had forgotten their purpose. He stood in her doorway, and he looked at her, and she could see him taking in the office. The exposed brick, the large windows, the team visible through the glass wall of the conference room, the awards on the shelf, the logo on the wall. And something moved across his face that was too complicated to be a single emotion. It was recognition. It was calculation. It was the slow, terrible dawning of a man realizing that the person he had discarded had become the thing he had failed to remain. Elena, he said. Her name sounded different in his mouth than it used to, smaller, like he was asking permission to say it. She didn't stand up. She didn't offer him a seat. She waited, because she had learned, in the 9 years since he had told her it was just business, that silence was a form of power, and that the person who spoke first in a room like this was the person with something to lose. He spoke first. He told her that Whitfield and Crane was gone. Not struggling, not downsizing. Gone. The company had lost its 3 largest clients in 2022, all of them companies that had moved to digital-first agencies that could do what Whitfield and Crane had never learned to do because Gerald had been too proud and too set in his ways to adapt. Derek, who had been running the company since Gerald's semi-retirement in 2019, had made a series of catastrophic decisions, overexpanding into markets they didn't understand, hiring expensive talent they couldn't retain, and alienating the mid-tier clients who had been the company's bread and butter for 30 years. The company had filed for bankruptcy in October of 2023. The building on Fayetteville Street was now occupied by a co-working space. The mahogany desk had been sold at auction. The motivational posters were in a landfill. Gerald Whitfield, who had built a company worth $12 million at its peak, was living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cary, paying $1,400 a month in rent, with a retirement fund that had been gutted by the bankruptcy, and a reputation in the industry that was, in his own words, finished. He said all of this while standing, because Elena had not told him to sit. He said it with the careful, measured diction of a man who had rehearsed this speech, probably in his car in the parking lot, probably more than once. And then he arrived at the part he had come for. He said he was looking for work. He said he had expertise in client relations and business development. He said he believed he could be an asset to a growing firm. He said he had heard about Puente. Everyone had heard about Puente. And he said he admired what Elena had built. He used the word admired. He said it the way you say a word you're not accustomed to saying, carefully, as though it might break. Elena listened to all of it. She listened the way she had always listened, completely, with the full weight of her attention, the way she had listened from the back of conference rooms, the way she had listened to Patricia, the way she had listened to Mei Ling describe her grandmother's pho recipe, the way she had listened to her mother's silence on the other end of the phone for 4 minutes when she told her she was pregnant. She listened to Gerald Whitfield ask her for a job, and she let the silence hold for 7 seconds after he finished, which is a long time when you are standing in someone else's office asking for something you do not deserve. What she felt was not satisfaction. That surprised her. She had imagined this moment, not this specific moment, not Gerald in her office, but some version of vindication, some scene in which the people who had thrown her away were forced to see what she had become. She had imagined it would feel like victory, like justice, like the climax of the story her life was telling. But it didn't feel like any of those things. It felt like looking at a ruin, not the ruin of Whitfield and Crane, the ruin of a man. A 76-year-old man standing in a suit that didn't fit, asking for something he had taken from someone else without a second thought, and not yet understanding. She could see it in his eyes, the slight confusion, the residual entitlement, not yet fully understanding what he had done. Not just to her, to every woman whose career he had quietly suffocated, to every employee he had treated as disposable, to himself. He had built a company on the belief that people were replaceable, and now he stood in the office of the person he had replaced, discovering that he was the one who could not be put back. She thought about Patricia. Patricia had retired in 2020, had moved to Asheville, grew tomatoes in a garden she called ridiculous and beautiful. They talked every month. Patricia had told her years ago in the office, with the closed door and the lowered voice, that forgiveness was not a feeling. It was a decision. It was something you did not for the other person, but for yourself, because carrying anger was like paying rent on a space someone else lived in for free. Elena had understood this intellectually for a long time. She understood it in her body now, sitting in her office, looking at Gerald Whitfield, and feeling the anger she had carried for 9 years begin to loosen. Not dissolve, not disappear, but loosen, like a knot that has been rained on for so long that the fibers have softened past the point of holding. She told him to sit down. He sat. She poured him a glass of water from the pitcher on her desk, and he took it with both hands, which told her more about his current state than anything he had said. She told him she was not going to hire him. She said this plainly, without cruelty, without drama. She said, "I'm not going to hire you, Gerald, because this company was built on the principle that people are not disposable, and hiring the man who taught me what it feels like to be disposed of would undermine everything this place stands for." She let that sit. She watched him receive it. The flinch, the swallow, the slight drop of the shoulders that told her the rehearsed speech had not included a plan for rejection. Then she said something she had not planned to say, something that came from the part of her that was Rosa's daughter, the part that had been raised to believe that dignity was built, not given, and that cruelty, even justified cruelty, diminished the person who wielded it as much as the person who received it. She said, "But I know people, I know this industry, and I can make some calls." She said she would put him in touch with a colleague who ran a nonprofit that helped small businesses with financial planning, an older organization, understaffed, in need of someone who understood the landscape. The pay was modest, the work was unglamorous, but it was work, and it was honest. Gerald looked at her for a long time, and then he said quietly, in a voice that sounded nothing like the voice she remembered from the fourth-floor office, the voice that had said, "This is just business." He said, "I'm sorry, Elena. I should have said it 9 years ago. I should have said it before you walked out of my office. I was a coward. I chose the easy thing. I told myself it was business because that was easier than admitting it was wrong." She nodded. She did not say it's okay, because it was not okay. And she had learned from Patricia and from Lucia, and from her own long, grinding, beautiful years of building something from nothing, that forgiveness did not require lying. She said, "I hear you." She said, "I believe you mean it, and that's enough for today." He left her office 20 minutes later. She sat at her desk for a long time afterward, looking at the cactus on the small shelf David had built, which was green and alive and covered in tiny new spines that caught the afternoon light. She thought about the parking lot. She thought about the box. She thought about the 7 seconds of silence in which she had decided never to work for someone else again. She thought about rice and beans and Tupperware containers appearing on doorsteps and a cracked phone screen and a baby sleeping in a car seat in the corner of an office that smelled like fabric softener. She thought about what it had cost: years, sleep, health, the particular loneliness of building something when no one is watching and no one believes it will last. She thought about what it had given her, not just the company, not just the money or the clients or the awards on the shelf. Something harder to quantify and more valuable than all of it. The bone-deep knowledge that she could not be destroyed. That the worst thing she had ever feared, losing everything, being cast out, starting from zero with nothing but herself, had already happened, and she had survived it. Not gracefully, not easily, not without scars, but completely. That evening, she picked up Lucia from school. Lucia was 8 years old, had Elena's dark eyes and David's quiet steadiness, and was carrying a science project about photosynthesis that involved a bean plant in a paper cup that was leaning dramatically to the left. In the car, Lucia said, "Mom, did you have a good day?" And Elena thought about the question, the simplicity of it, the innocence of it, the impossibility of answering it honestly to an 8-year-old who still believed that days were either good or bad, when the truth was that this day had been the most complicated of her life since the day she stood in a parking lot holding a box. She said, "Yeah, baby, I had a really good day." And she meant it in the way that complicated, hard-won, imperfect things can be good, not because nothing hard happened, but because she was still here, still building, still standing in her own life, in her own company, in the full, aching, extraordinary weight of everything she had earned. They drove home. David had made dinner, not pad thai, not tonight, but something new, a recipe he'd been experimenting with, involving too much garlic and not enough salt, which Lucia would complain about, and Elena would eat every bite of because it was made by hands she loved in a house they owned, on a street where the magnolia tree was blooming for the first time that spring, its white flowers opening like small, deliberate promises against the darkening sky. Rosa was coming for Sunday dinner. Patricia had sent a photograph of her tomatoes. Mei Ling's restaurant now had 3 locations. Jordan, the first employee Elena had ever hired, was now Puente's creative director. The bean plant leaned left on the kitchen counter. The cactus was alive. The bridge held. If you're watching this right now, if you're sitting somewhere with a box in your hands, literal or not, if someone has told you that you are expendable, that your value has an expiration date, that what you carry inside you is a liability rather than a gift. I want you to hear something that no termination letter and no man behind a mahogany desk can take from you. You are not what they say you are. You are not what they did to you. You are what you build after. And building is slow, and it's unglamorous, and there will be months when you eat rice, and months when you cry in parking lots, and months when the only thing keeping you going is a kick against your ribs that says, I'm still here. But you are still here, and that is not nothing. That is everything. That is the bridge, and it holds.